Hello friends, for today's video, I wanted to have a little bit of a discussion, not necessarily just about this book, but also a concept that has emerged as a result of me having read this book. The book in question would be Agnes Auber's Mystical Cat Shelter. While I thought that the book was very charming and cute and fun, I have some conflicting feelings. What's inspiration and what maybe crosses a line into being fan fiction? Before I get into the details of all of this, though, I want to make very clear that I am by no means accusing this author of plagiarism. I think that anytime an author is inspired by another work, of course, there are going to be aspects to it that are what a lot of us use to provide comp titles, or a lot of us will say, if you like this, try that. There's a lot about this that's really similar. Every work is in some ways inspired by something else. Even the household names within the genre, within various different interviews or just in general when they're talking about their process, they will all be open about the fact that we are sponges. We are constantly collecting different authorial voices, or we're collecting how an author subverts your expectations, or how authors deliver characters to you, the dialogue. We're always taking this in, whether it be through the books that we read or the movies we watch, the TV shows that we watch, the video games we play. We're constantly soaking things up. And so inevitably, if you become a writer yourself or a storyteller in some fashion, those inspirations are going to come through. And it's why you can trace, if you look back at a lot of how fantasy came to be what it is today, you will see almost a through line of who was very much inspired by Tolkien, why things feel really similar to Tolkien for a while, and then you kind of get the new version of, okay, well, here's Tad Williams, here's Robin Hobb, here's Robert Jordan, and you kind of keep going. And then eventually you have the way of breaking from that, and then you get the Joe Abercrombies, who are like, what if I took the hero's journey and I flipped it on its head, and I was like, what if all this was for nothing? And you get authors that are doing something with the familiar, but you can't really do that until you have something that's established as familiar. But even then, you're sort of playing off of something that already exists. So of course, there are always going to be those things present. And then obviously we have formal retellings, and that is very clear of, I'm taking this thing everybody's familiar with, but I'm doing something different with it, or I'm focusing on a different character. I'm trying to highlight the ways in which the time it was written might have not had as much nuance about this topic. And so now, because society has changed, I think it'd be really interesting to revisit it. There's so many different reasons why it is not bad to actually have things be more obviously inspired by something else. But of course, sometimes things can lead into being so heavily inspired. And I don't really know where the line is necessarily, and that's kind of why I wanted to have this conversation. However, in order to have it, I have to go through the similarities between this book and then the book that I'm comparing it to / film would be Howl's Moving Castle. If you have watched the film by Studio Ghibli, Howl's Moving Castle, or read the book, likely when you picked up this story, you yourself probably noticed some of the pretty clear, I would think, parallels between the two. I probably don't have to necessarily spell it out, but I do want to work through all of the things that I found to be quite similar between them. And on its surface, any one of these isn't that big of a deal. It was the collection of a lot of these. And I think for me, where the line starts to maybe get crossed into, I'm not enjoying this quite as much as I might have otherwise, is if I start to be able to predict the progression of the plot, because I am so familiar with the other story that I'm like, well, now I know exactly how this story is going to unfold because you're doing the same things as what was there. If you are still planning on picking this book up, which I'm not dissuading anybody from doing, and I also am not, once again, trying to imply that this book is problematic or anything like that, but if you want to read it and you don't want to hear about some of the plot progression and pieces within it that exist, then maybe hop off so that you don't have anything spoiled for you. In order to go through some of this, I do have to reveal some of these things. So I'm going to do that now. And then after having gone through a lot of this, I would love to know your thoughts about all of this. And when is it maybe leaning into being too similar to you? When is it not that big of a deal? And maybe you've even read this and checked out Howl's Moving Castle and you personally didn't even think they were that similar. And if that's your perspective, then feel free to chime in with that as well. But officially jumping into some of the similarities between the two. So if you don't know anything about either of these stories, let me first start with a synopsis of what Mystical Cat Shelter is about. Agnes Aubert leads a meticulously organized life, and she likes it that way. As a proudly type A manager of a much needed cat rescue charity, she has devoted her life to finding forever homes for lost cats. But after she is forced to move the cat shelter, Agnes learns that her new landlord is using her charity as a front for an internationally renowned and thoroughly disreputable magic shop. Owned by the disorganized, not to mention self absorbed, irritating, but also decidedly handsome Havelock Renard, magician and failed Dark Lord, the shop draws magical clientele from around the world, partly due to the quality of Havelock's illicit goods, as well as their curiosity about his shadowy past and rumors of his incredible power. Agnes's charity offers the perfect cover for illegal magics. Agnes couldn't care less about the shop, magical intrigue or not. There are cats to be rescued. But when an enemy from Havelock's past surfaces, the magic shop, and more importantly, the cat shelter, are suddenly in jeopardy. To save the shelter, will Agnes have to set aside her social conscience and protect the man who once tried to bring about the apocalypse and is now trying to steal her heart? From that synopsis alone, which I had seen ahead of time, but I didn't necessarily think it seemed all that similar to Howl's Moving Castle. I am going to more so reference Howl's Moving Castle, the film, for the rest of this video, but just know that also there are some changes from the book, and the book is the source material. But in Howl's Moving Castle, the film, you follow a young woman named Sophie who works at a hat shop. And Sophie in life is just kind of stagnant. There's not necessarily anything she feels exceptionally passionate about, and that includes her own happiness. And then one day, while a war is transpiring kind of in the background, and generally throughout the background of the entirety of the story, this man, this very well-known wizard named Howl, helps her get away from some of these other people. And then from there, she has a curse placed upon her from this witch. This curse then forces her to live as an elderly woman. And then she ends up finding herself taken in by Howl's moving castle, which is known throughout the land. And she just kind of starts to live within this castle, seeking a place of refuge in a sense. Through this, she gets to know Howl and his little apprentice. And there, once again, is a war waging in the background, and all sorts of strange things transpire. And it is very whimsical and magical and a little bit cozy and a little bit romantic also. I think by just looking at the synopses of both of these stories, you don't necessarily have a whole lot of overlap other than she works at a hat shop. She works with cats, which they're not that similar. It's just more of like you have these two young women who have professional jobs and are currently having a lot of their life occupied through that. And then you have these magical, eccentric figures, and they inevitably get roped up in each other's lives. So that, on surface level, by no means am I like, they're already so similar. They're not. They're pretty different in their general, just the blueprint that they both have. But yes, Agnes and Sophie have a lot in common, and Havelock and Hal have a lot in common, which we'll go through. But I want to start with the thing that right from the start, I thought, oh, this is reminding me of Howl's Moving Castle. And when I first thought it, I didn't think of this in a negative way. I was just kind of like, oh, I love Howl's Moving Castle, and I like that there's some parallels here. So there's two things right away that made me think of it. First off, as the synopsis noted, Agnes is looking for a new place to have for her cat shelter. And she ends up finding a place, but there's a lot of investigations happening, and there are questions about whether magic is being used somehow within this shop. When the wizard-like character, Havelock, shows up, he ends up transporting the interior of this space into another building. And that's very similar to in Howl's Moving Castle. The castle itself has this door, and if you turn certain knobs on the door and you open it, you arrive in different places, as if it actually has a physical location in different areas, depending on which door you move. It's very fantastical and borderline nonsensical, but it feels like magic. And so him transporting the space felt like that. Also later in the film in Howl's Moving Castle, like literally he reshapes the entire interior. And then when they open the door, they're back in this place where Sophie initially kind of started. So she's kind of back in her hat shop, and he's reformed the castle's interior to also be more accommodating of her and their like growing found family, if you will. That already I was like, oh, that's cool. That reminds me of Howl's Moving Castle. And then there was another part though that I thought, okay, if this progresses the way I think it's progressing, that's a little, I don't know. It's a little bit too predictable now. So upon Agnes first meeting Havelock, he says something to the effect of, "Oh, you're here," or "Oh, it's you," something like that, which of course is not something you typically say to a person that you're meeting for the first time. In Howl's Moving Castle, the first time that Howl meets Sophie, he says, "I've been looking everywhere for you." And you think initially that he's saying that because these two kind of intimidating men are bothering Sophie. And so it comes across like he is pretending like, "Oh, this is my wife," or "This is my partner." Like, "Oh, I've been looking everywhere for you, darling. Like, let's get going." That's the impression it kind of comes across as. But then later you find out that through some interesting time magic, Sophie actually saw Hal when he was a boy, and she said, "Wait for me, I'll find you," because she knows the secret to saving him. That line has a double meaning when you see it in hindsight, the "I've been looking everywhere for you," because there is kind of this Hal has always been searching for whoever this woman was that told him, "Wait for me, I'll find you." When this character says, "Oh, it's you," or something to that effect, this particular line makes me wonder if there's gonna be some kind of time magic component where she goes back in time to try and save him, and then that means he's aware of her, but she doesn't know it just yet because she hasn't traveled back in time just yet, and then so I was kinda like, well, we'll see. Maybe it won't be doing that, but it kind of feels like that line was stated in a way that feels very similar, so let's put a pin in this, we'll return to it. So, I had these thoughts right from the start. Also, I did feel like Sophie and Howl that Agnes and Havelock felt quite a bit like them, even in their personality types, which even the synopsis is kinda hitting, like, she's really tidy and she's type A, and he's eccentric and over the top, and yes, that is true of their characters. But how it plays out in the plot, I think there are ways you can execute these concepts and these character types without it feeling necessarily too similar. So, for example, I actually felt like in the Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia Fairies series, I think Wendell had some parallels to Hal, and I think that Emily had some parallels to Sophie, but they felt different enough. You could just see some similarities in their dynamics and them as people in general. Here, the similarities, they just were too similar. Even how he is described as being dressed, he's described as having this kind of almost flamboyant look to him. Then we started to get some other details that I thought, Duh, I mean, it's basically Howl. It's just basically Howl, and I do apologize that I'm so on repeat of saying "it's like this" or "reminded me of this" or similarities. I'm gonna be saying that's probably way too much, but he also uses beauty potions, basically, or beauty spells. In Howl's Moving Castle, if you've ever looked up images and you haven't actually seen the film, perhaps you are surprised to know that all of the shots of Hal, that it's all the same person. You'll see him with black hair, you'll see him with blonde hair, you'll see him with orange hair. So you see him looking different across the film because he has many different looks and he is very self-absorbed. He cares a lot about his looks. There's a part where he says something very dramatic, like, "What's the point of living if I can't be beautiful?" I mean, he says something super over the top. He also has a tendency to wear a certain style of shirt that's a little bit flowier, and that's kind of the style that's often described of Havelock in this as well. But Havelock does have beauty spells and potions basically that he is utilizing and he is kind of experimenting with. His rationalization is that he wants to try them on himself before possibly selling them to other people in case they have bad side effects. But it doesn't change the fact that his appearance is frequently slightly changing and that he does seem slightly into his own appearance. Also, when Agnes first discovers his space within this shop, as she's going into it, the way it's described, you might as well just look at the parts of Howl's Moving Castle and the spaces that are his specifically, like his bedroom as an example, and you might as well just describe that, and that's basically the description for Havelock's space. It is a little bit chaotic and extremely messy, and I thought, "Please, please, please don't have Agnes clean it," because that's kind of what Sophie does, and it's not kind of, that is what Sophie does. Sophie is like, "Well, I gotta clean this space up because we won't be having a space that looks like this," and sure enough, Agnes is like, "I'm gonna take it upon myself to clean this." And I don't know, a little bit, I was like, I mean, it's starting to just starting to add up. He also in so this is one of the things that's, like, different in the book versus the movie. So he does have an apprentice. Howl has an apprentice in both the book and the movie. In the movie, they make him much, much younger, so he's a little boy. In the book, he's not a little boy. But also in this story, Havelock has an apprentice as well. And I even wish we could have done more to differentiate, like give him multiple apprentices or make the apprentice have a very drastically different personality than Howl's apprentice or something. But they had kind of similar personalities also. Again, in the film, this is where if we're comparing the film to this book here, then it's a decent difference because it's a literal child. But if we compare it to the book, then it is more alike. Also, beyond Havelock having similar looks to Hal and beyond Havelock having certain tendencies like Hal, he also has a monstrous form, just like Hal does in the film. So in the film, which is a lot more symbolic, I would say, in the film, Hal turns into this almost bird-like creature. And there's a lot of interpretations as to what the point is of this edition. But one of them is that because Miyazaki's films often have anti-violence and anti-war themes, whenever Hal is trying to fight and defend, it's almost like each time he comes back, he becomes more and more of a monster, as if the more that you are engaged in that, the less of yourself returns and the more of the monstrous side returns. And you do see that it seems as though if he keeps pushing himself, he won't be able to return back to his human form. That's kind of one of the many different interpretations of that. Havelock in this story, magic has to do with this mysterious forest place, and the more that you go to that place, the more that you get involved in magic, the more that you do basically lose some of yourself to that space, so that each time you come back, it's almost as if you're incorporeal, that you're not entirely there, so to speak, but also he literally has a monstrous form. And fortunately, the monstrous form was not necessarily described as this bird-like form. They both are dark and more sinister in appearance, but they were a little bit different. His is a little bit more like shadowy than Howl's, but once again, it was just kind of another thing that if it was in isolation, I wouldn't think too much of it. It was just on top of many other things that are alike. Also, as far as the dynamics between Hal and Sophie versus Agnes and Havelock, Hal does something in the film that is very, very sweet and romantic, where he ends up making a door. When you open it, it goes into this beautiful space that's basically for Sophie. If ever Sophie needs to get away, if ever Sophie needs to feel at peace or feel calm, she can come to this space. And it also has a little bit of a tie to him as well. It's something that is deeply personal to him. And in this story, at one point, Havelock is talking about the places that he's been. And Agnes is talking about, oh, I would love to go to this place, but I've never really had the chance to travel. Toward the end of the story, I was kind of like, I know that he's going to have a space that opens up and it's going to be the area she's always wanted to go to. And it's also going to be an area he's been to. And that's what he does. And it's very sweet and it's cute and it's romantic, but it was very similar, once again, to House of Castle. So all this is happening. But now returning to the part that I said, oh, as I was reading, I thought, let me put a pin in this and we'll see what happens, which is when he has that kind of odd line to her, like, oh, it's you, that line. And I thought, please don't have some kind of time travel component where they've already secretly met and he's been waiting for her to save him. And that's exactly what happens. And I'm like, okay, well, that's a little too much for me. To reiterate for I don't know how many times at this point, but I'm not saying that it is too much in the sense that it is plagiarism and they copied and they should owe money or anything like that. Too much in the sense that I felt the book was predictable. I also just found myself continuously thinking, I just want to go watch the movie now because there wasn't as much done to differentiate between the other material, whether it's the source material of the book Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones or the Studio Ghibli film. But there wasn't enough about this story that felt unique and separate. There were a couple of things, for example, her love of cats and the way cats are incorporated. That was obviously a very different addition from Howl's Moving Castle. And then also, our main character is actually a widow, and there's some commentary on what it's like to live beyond grief. And I actually feel like we could have done so much more with those two things to really differentiate the stories. But even if we had, I still found it was as if the aesthetic, the setting, the character types, a lot of the ingredients, while it's like you added a couple of others, at the end of the day, the ingredients all kind of led to the same end result. I don't know how to feel because I thought the story was cute. It had enough distinctions in its story where I didn't think it was a literal copy. But when I talk about what are the ethics of situations like these, I guess with retellings, it's very clear that you are trying to have source material that people are familiar with, and thus you are doing something different. And there's something about when, because this isn't a retelling, it's not a formal retelling, but there's something about when it's not acknowledged, even in the synopsis I read. Maybe other synopses in other places include comp titles and they include House Moving Castle, but in this one in particular, it doesn't. And it feels like a way to be like, well, hopefully, marketing. I'm not saying the author would feel this way, but in like marketing, they know it's they know what they're doing when they make comp titles. And I also feel like by omitting House Moving Castle, the most obvious comp title, they also maybe knew what they were doing because it's so similar that it was like, let's not tell people it's like House Moving Castle because we don't want to draw attention to just how similar it is. Because, and I've thought this before, conversations about, for example, books that were previously fan fiction that then were rewritten so that they could eventually be traditionally published. I think some of those books have far less in common with the thing that they were originally inspired by than this book had. And this book is not being marketed as fan fiction, or it was once fan fiction and now is Agnes Aubert's Mystical Cat Shelter. And I think part of my frustration is that sometimes a little bit I'm like, man, is it really just when we hear the word fan fiction or it started as fan fiction that that's what makes us analyze similarities? Whereas if you just don't say fan fiction, then they almost, I don't like the term can get away with it because that implies that they're getting away with something, some kind of wrongdoing. So I'm not trying to imply that, but it just seems like the way we discuss works that were previously fan fiction, there is sometimes an inherent dislike, even if the author goes out of their way to completely transform the story to the point where you wouldn't even ever have known, you would not have known where any of its inspirations came from. But there is just kind of this inherent dislike or looking down upon, or even deciding that there's no creativity or no effort put in, or very little at the very least, if it originally was fan fiction. We kind of have this general feel. But then with this over here, it's like, well, we won't say it. So then nobody will maybe, acknowledge it. And thus, maybe people just won't notice. And then, this author's already got a pretty successful career, so people will give them benefit of the doubt and they won't ever think to compare it so harshly to something else. I personally think if you like House Moving Castle, this is probably gonna read a little bit for you like fan fiction of it. Again, if you have a different perspective, if you have enjoyed both and you personally didn't feel that way, then I welcome the disagreement and you can elaborate as to why you felt differently. The reason though that I keep hitting the point that I don't think that this is necessarily crossing into territory of, oh, this is just plagiarism or this is just a copy is because of the fact there were enough distinctions that made this its own, that made it stand on its own. It's not like I was like, wait, what? This book doesn't even make sense because we're somehow leaving out important key points. They were able to shape the story around their own characters and their own motivations and their own personalities and other such things. Where there has been a book that I've read in the past that I pretty much just don't bring up on this channel because I feel the publisher failed the author a little bit in encouraging them to change their story more. There is a book where even exact phrases and word choice that is specific to what I'm going to call the source material was used in the published work that I was like, okay, it's too much. It's way too much. It's way too similar. The magic system, specific scenes, it was in some ways just taking from, and it started to not feel as much like inspired by. This still feels like inspired by, but maybe for me personally, maybe inspired too much. I don't know where that line is though, and it's going to change from person to person. And also, I do think, and I invite all of you to let me know your thoughts on this. Do you think that we're sometimes queued up to notice these things a lot more if we hear the term fan fiction? Or do you think that's not as much of a problem? Do you feel like readers across the board tend to notice these things anyway? What are your thoughts on all of this? Where for you does it tend to impact it? Do you think it's not that big of a deal? But it's kind of a I don't know what to do with these thoughts and feelings sort of video discussion. And then it's like, here, tell me, what do you think? I'm just tossing it back to all of you. So I invite all of you to join in on this discussion. Thanks, though, for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.